the first Allied central base, was at Townsville, in sparsely populated Queensland, Australia. It was a small, agricultural city of some 25,000 prior to the war, although the civilian population shrunk as many people left for the safer southern states after Pearl Harbor. It was connected to Brisbane by a single-track railroad, its gauge different than that used in the rest of the country. Townsville had a small shallow harbor, with poor docking facilities. The poor could and was improved. It did have large pieces of flat solid ground, and some local resources to aid construction. Townsville's ultimate preeminence was unplanned. General Brett and the Australian government originally were more concerned about Darwin. The Japanese attacked Darwin several times with long-range bombers, and it appeared a likely place for a Japanese landing. Furthermore, in theory, it was a good place to launch operations against the East Indies in the event Darwin was both too primitive and too remote to serve as a good offensive base. Any Allied amphibious operation launched out of it would have been well outside of fighter range and thus required aircraft carriers unavailable for months, and no Allied admiral would have relished operations in the confined waters of the Indies, ringed by dozens of Japanese air bases and several good anchorages for combined fleet. Indeed, it was the remoteness of Darwin that saved it from Japanese invasion in the early weeks of the war. In the event there was sharp air combat at Darwin early in the war, and the first United States fighters deployed to Australia served there. Nevertheless, by July 1942, it was obvious that the locus of operations was not to be west from Darwin but north from Townsville to Port Moresby. Darwin also remained primarily an Australian responsibility. The first United States engineer unit to arrive in the north went to Darwin, but soon the effort shifted to Townsville, nearby Queensland areas, and New Guinea. In March 1942, United States engineers, still badly short of equipment, began building at Woodstock, 20 miles southwest of Townsville, with crews working 8-hour shifts around the clock. One runway received an aircraft 4 days after construction began. Another company of engineers constructed a 20,500 feet by 100-foot strip covered by pierced steel plank, often called mat. This was not ideal surfacing but was quick to install and far better than nothing, particularly if there was mud. A third strip in more demanding terrain was operational in 2 weeks. At the same time, Australian contractors scraped together every available piece of machinery and began constructing a field at Charters Towers, about 40 miles north of Townsville. Problems arose, however, when the Americans began pressing for fields in northern Queensland on Cape York Peninsula. The Australian government decided that civilian contractors should not work north of Townsville, lest they suffer air attack or be captured and executed if an invasion took place. Fortunately, the humble Queensland Roads Commission stepped in and provided invaluable help to the undersupplied American engineers, adding an important base at Mariba near the small coastal town of K. A joint group even built a small field at Horn Island just north of Cape York Peninsula. Initially, the fields were crude affairs. They lacked revetments, drainage, and taxiways, and the all-important ground facilities were extremely primitive. Yet, as machinery began to arrive, much of it requisitioned stolen for competing projects in southern Australia, which were delayed for months. The capabilities of the Queensland bases increased tremendously. By the end of 1943, there were 28 fields in Queensland, most clustered around towns. Another 9 operated in the Darwin area. Allied engineers constructed a similar number near Perth in case of a backdoor Japanese attack. Although Townsville was a harsh area, several of these fields were improved and became the best outside southern Australia. Engineers also constructed full-service facilities for maintenance and aircraft overhaul. The facilities in Townsville and Queensland became far better than those at Rabaul, and eventually the price was paid by the Japanese. The buildup in Queensland was part of a strategic debate that is still sensitive in Australia. In early 1942, there was much talk of the so-called Brisbane Line. The idea, sensibly, was that the southeastern quadrant of Australia should receive priority for defence planning. This included the major cities of Melbourne, Sydney, and Canberra. Because Australia was so large, went the reasoning, the frontier areas could be liberated when Australian forces were properly trained. In addition, the militia forces mobilized early in the war were Organized on a state basis, states had great power in the Australian political system, and they expected their units to defend their homes. In retrospect, this argument was complex. Canberra early in the Pacific War had no idea where its two precious volunteer divisions would go. The 6th and 7th Australian Independent Force Divisions had already distinguished themselves in the Mid-East. Canberra agreed that they be moved from the Mid-East to the Malay barrier within days after Pearl Harbor. It was obvious to Canberra that the precious F Division was going to die trying to preserve the British position in Singapore. Sensibly, Australian Prime Minister John J. Curtin demanded the return of 7th and 6th Divisions to Australia, showing a bit of madness that marred his career. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill supported General Sir Archibald Wavell in asking Canberra for the services of either one or both of the divisions to defend Burma, although it is difficult to make such judgments. Wall's request and Churchill's endorsement of it probably did much to reinforce the growing attitude in Canberra that the United States and not Great Britain would defend Australia. It was a relationship that surprised both countries. Australia in early 1942 believed itself an obvious target of the Japanese juggernaut. The card held up the sleeve of the government was the use and placement of the two veteran divisions returning from the Mid-East. Their arrival in March 1942 corresponded with the arrival of General MacArthur. MacArthur had abandoned an army, albeit on the orders of President Roosevelt, yet more than any Australian General, MacArthur knew the strengths and weaknesses of the enemy. He also realistically appreciated the strength of his own forces, whether MacArthur was a strategic genius or required conquest to compensate for past failures. I will let others judge. It is true regardless that when MacArthur was made Supreme Commander Southwest Pacific Forces in April 1942, he already had the plans and the will to annihilate Japan. I doubt whether there was a better way to do this grisly job than MacArthur's. Nevertheless, the MacArthur debate began long before the confrontation on the Yalu during Korea. Simply put, MacArthur was determined to move the war effort away from southeastern Australia to the north and into New Guinea. Initially, he received lukewarm support from a government that, unlike the United States, feared for its existence and had suffered desperate failures in Southeast Asia. Specifically, MacArthur was determined to hold Port Moresby and use it as a base to attack the Japanese in March 1942. The enterprise appeared to be a long shot, and as noted above, would have been impossible without the aid of Japanese blunders. Indeed, the 3,000-man militia garrison, which suffered frequent Japanese air attacks, suffered from low morale, fearing with good reason that they would either have to go bush when a Japanese invasion fleet appeared on the horizon or fall into captivity. Repeatedly promised air reinforcement that had not yet arrived. The garrison troops began referring to Tomorrow Hawks or Never Hawks, a playoff of the Kitty Hawk designation that Australians used for the American P-4 Warhawk fighter. Port Moresby possesses a grand name, but the reality in early 1942 was very different. Instead of being a port and a town, Moresby was a miserable little colonial settlement that had received slight military reinforcement prior to the war. Prior to the summer of 1942, Moresby had two fields, including 7-mile drone of 5,000 feet surfaced runway that had been constructed with United States funds prior to the war as part of the Philippines Ferry Project, but had been badly maintained and bombed several times by the Japanese. The nomenclature in naming airfields was unusual at Port Moresby, as all fields had names that reflected their distance from the port. Consequently, there was 3M drone, 7-mile drone, 12M drone, and so forth. All of these fields had official names. S-mile was officially Jackson Field. Most pilots, however, ever continued to favor using the distance names. There was also 3-mile drone, a converted civilian strip that was, in the words of one pilot, a 3,000-foot roller coaster with 300 feet hills at its ends and grades to make your hair stand on end. Bill Eaton with the 43rd Bomb Group saw Moresby early in the war. The Great Port Moresby was a pier and a couple of tin-roof buildings. Its only importance was its ability to project power. Port Moresby was a key point in the development or exploitation of New Guinea. It was one of the few points of contact with the outside world that existed in that area of New Guinea. Whether it was worth having any contact is another question. Maybe the Japanese were as dumb as anybody else. Maybe they thought there was something they're worth. Taking what we would have lost was a couple of docks and a tin shack, but the main thing was that it was the place where the supplies and eventually military power flowed through. United States aircraft began to trickle into northern Australia, beginning in February 1942. A few unfortunate pilots fought the Japanese over Java. Material losses were worse than pilot losses. 57 precious new P-40 fighters were shipped to Java on the old aircraft carrier United States ship Langley, and a freighter Langley, the first aircraft carrier in United States service, but long past its useful life, was sunk in an air attack. The freighter landed and unloaded did 27 fighters, still in crates, because the Japanese progress was faster than anyone anticipated, and time was not available to assemble the aircraft. American sailors dumped the crated machines into the ocean to prevent their capture. General Brett ordered the Java survivors and new fighter squadrons arriving to proceed to Darwin. He sent bombers to Townsville. Thus, it was up to the Royal Australian Air Force to send No. 75 Squadron, one of the first 3 fighter squadrons founded on Australian soil since Pearl Harbor, to Port Moresby. During a valiant defense, half of the squadron became casualties, but the Allied presence was established and the Japanese began taking losses. 2 squadrons of the United States 8th Fighter Group relieved the Australians in May and February. A handful of B-7s operating out of Townsville began occasional shuttle raids on Rabaul itself, afraid that the Japanese would destroy any bombers based at Moresby. The B-7s would fly into Moresby, take on fuel, and then proceed to attack Rabaul. None of these raids did great damage, and Japan continued to have the initiative over the New Guinea skies, but it was exactly this Allied presence that so concerned Inu, and later led the Japanese army to take their desperate gamble over the Kokoda Trail. One of the first American units to arrive was the 1001st Anti-Aircraft Battalion, an anti-aircraft unit in May 1942. Moresby had 4 anti-aircraft guns and 5 machine guns to serve as air defense. Initially, the 1001 could add little but its own complement of heavy .50 caliber machine guns. It was already obvious that machine guns were poor anti-aircraft weapons because of their seriously limited range. Many soldiers and sailors called them revenge weapons because they could only down or damage an enemy after the foe had dropped its bombs. L.Y. Henderson was a young sergeant at the time and reflected on the ugly situation at Moresby at the time of the Battle of the Coral Sea. Moresby was bombed out when got there, and there were wrecks in the harbor. As I recall, there were 5 working aircraft on the field, 1 Hudson, 2 WWII, 2 P-39s, and the wreckage of a Ford Trota. A few more fighters came in, and so did some Aussie anti-aircraft. Our positions were around 7 Mile, or Jackson Drome. We called it Death Valley. The problem was that our fighters had a poor rate of climb, and our radar gave them very little warning when an air raid was on the way. However, if coast watchers got the word to us soon enough, our fighters would get up as high as they could, dive through the Japanese formation, keep right on going, until they came into Death Valley with the Zeros on their tail. There we would work over the Japanese that followed them down. I cannot say it was much of a death zone, but it did scare the hell out of the enemy, and we did get a few. We claimed 16. Later we got some 40mm cannon, which were much more effective. Slowly United States and Australian units deployed in Moresby, and none too soon. In July, South Seas Detachment began the audacious march over the Owen Stanley Mountains to capture Port Moresby. By this time, American and Australian engineers had completed 5 airfields at Moresby and were nearly done with 2 more. This was remarkable work considering the endemic shortages, miserable climate, and frequent air raids. Naturally, construction work under threat of air raid was a difficult matter. Moresby was within easy range of RAB's heavy bombers. In addition, in mid-1942, Allied anti-aircraft was still weak, and Japanese fighters commonly strafed positions. Sergeant Henderson was strafed himself. I had a small radio and picked up a mayday from one of our planes coming in. It was on the edge of an airfield, and there were about 150 engineers out there working on the field. This plane came over, and I set up a blocking position because I knew he would have Zeros behind him, and there were we knocked down 1, and 2 went away, hurting. I directed the fire, and I was under fire. It was stupid, really. There I was standing up on the entrenchment, giving the directions to my Machine gun crews. There was not much I could tell them with 3 zeros coming right, and let me say that getting strafed is very interesting. The plane that came in on me was close enough that I could have spit on him. One of the zeros went down and we claimed hits on the other 2. I was decorated that day, and so were several others. It was early in the war, and I think they were looking for some reason to give a medal to somebody. We had not had much good news, yet like many, bomber crewman Bill Eaton found himself on the receiving end of a raid in mid-1942. Eaton was at Mill Bay, just south of Morby. We had received orders to test a B-17 on the runway they made at Mill Bay. A red alert sounded. At first nothing, but then we hear this noise above us. There is this V of V's formation of enemy bombers at about 6,000 foot ideal bombing altitude. Everyone got into a ditch because we did not know where they were on their bomb run. When we saw them, they are almost directly overhead. If they had already dropped their bombs, the path would move under the plane. So it is very possible that they have already dropped, and the bombs are on the way pretty soon. You can pick the bombs up. You could see everything happening. There was no fighter cover, no anti-aircraft. They caught us napping. Just a clean bombing run. The bombs went right across our cantonment area and the airfield. We lost our aircraft, a couple of people dead, and a few wounded. These were small bombs and did their jobs. I once counted I had been through about 80 bombing raids. That was the only one that I could see everything perfectly and was right in the middle of the bomb pattern. When we were in the middle of the pattern, it was a crapshoot. You would keep down and hope for the best. The bombs dropping were an extraordinary sight. Every single one looks like it is coming straight at you. And it is. It misses you by about 10 yards up range, down range, off to the right, off to the left. But at the time you are looking, it is coming right at you. There is a technique at looking at bombs and knowing whether they are going over you or fall short. You look at them with your finger. If the bomb path stays right on your finger, they are coming right at you. If it traverses on past your finger, it is going over. If it traverses short of your finger, it is dropping short. If it looks like it is coming right at you, you might have time to get to another hole. That is what we were taught. The time of flight of these things is several seconds. When these guys were over, I did not need to use my finger because they were putting their bombs right in the barrel. Despite Japanese pressure, the Allied buildup continued. Well over 20,000 garrison and service troops were stationed at Morby by the end of July. At that time, MacArthur brought in 2 brigades of the crack Australian 7 Event Division to deal with South Seas Detachment, although it took them some time to acclimate to the hideous conditions in New Guinea. The Australians stalled the Japanese simultaneously. The Marines landed at Guadalcanal, and Japanese air units shifted almost entirely to the furious battle there, leaving South Sea Detachment alone. MacArthur brought up a United States division, and the Japanese retreated toward the coastal town of Bua, where they were demolished after a savage siege. MacArthur's greatest hopes had come to fruition with Morby firmly in Allied hands. An offensive campaign in New Guinea was possible for a year and a half. Morby served as the most important base in New Guinea. By fall, almost all American engineers had been moved up from Queensland to New Guinea. One of their most important jobs was to transform Morby into a true port. Once this was accomplished, the sinew of war could come steadily into the New Guinea theater. In addition, bomb groups originally based at Townsville were free to move up to Morby. When Japan was forced to go on the defensive, it was chilling news for Tokyo, and even more than defeat at Guadalcanal precipitated a massive Japanese reinforcement of the South Pacific Theater. But in order to carry forth an offensive in New Guinea, the All-Allies required more fields closer to the front. The biggest problem with Port Morby was that it was south of the Owen Stanley Mountains and Bua, whereas subsequent battlefields were north of them. This posed little problem for bombers and transports, barring the danger posed by ferocious weather. But crawling through the major mountain pass through the Owen Stanleys seriously reduced fighter range, particularly for the first generation of United States aircraft. It was no easy quest to find airfields in New Guinea. Many small fields suitable for civilian light planes proved unsuitable for military use. The tremendous rainfall caused a high water table almost everywhere, and enormous trees made things worse. The first stroke of good fortune took place in June 1942. MacArthur badly wanted an air base and port at Mill Bay at the tip of Papua New Guinea. He feared correctly that the Japanese would have designs on it. He also realized it would be very helpful as a supply base for operations up the coast of northeastern New Guinea. On June 8th, a 12-man party of Australians and Americans commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Leverett G. Yoda of the Army Corps of Engineers surveyed Mill Bay and found A.L. Brothers Coconut Plantation at the head of Mill Bay that would serve as the location for at least 3 strips and a good wharf. The American engineers went to work and had 2 basic fighter strips operating within a month. An Australian militia battalion soon followed, as did 2 Royal Australian Air Force fighter squadrons when it was obvious in late August that the Japanese were going to try to seize Mill Bay. Several battalions of the 7th Division reinforced days later. Elite Japanese naval attack troops landed. After some anxious moments, the Japanese were soundly defeated, with Australian P-4S causing serious damage. Yoda soon made a far more important geological find in early July, 2 weeks prior to the Japanese landings. Yoda and another party flew to Bua in search of an area for a good strip. They decided that the small strip at Bua itself had no potential. However, they found a plain covered with 10 high kanai grass near the village of Dobadura, 15 miles south of Buona. Yoda and his group enthusiastically reported that Doder would prove a perfect place for a major base complex. MacArthur's airmen were delighted with the new news, but soon learned that South Sea's detachment was headed for Bua. Ironically, the timing could not have been better. Had United States engineers begun construction prior to the Japanese landing, it is very likely that the Japanese would have been sorely tempted to make use of it, as it was the Japanese landing at Buona could not be stopped. There is no evidence that Japanese engineers found the strategic gold lying at Dodura. However, when the Australians drove the Japanese back to American engineers knew exactly where to construct a badly needed field. Dobadura was in its way every bit as important as Morbi. The Bua-Sananda campaign developed into a horrible battle of attrition between entrenched Japanese infantry and engineers and Australian and American soldiers. In November 1942, there were no shallow draft landing craft in the South Pacific. Uncertain waters meant small vessels. Therefore, the first Allied offensive relied upon a motley navy of barges, fishing boats, and yachts. Almost anything that was small and could stay afloat. The supply situation was a nightmare. The 32nd Division had no artillery, and the Australians only a handful of tubes. To use the vernacular, Dobadura was a godsend to the men fighting at Bua. Robert Rutherford was a young officer in an anti-aircraft unit assigned to protect the engineers building Dodura from air attack. He described its advantages. That was the first strip at Dobadura, and it was made of packed sand and clay. Eventually, there were 3 strips. It was an excellent strip because it drained quickly and compacted very well. When the engineers got in and put the steel matting down, they just put it on top. They barely needed it. The ground was so firm the river flowed right down the side of the strip. It looked like a floodplain from past eons. If you found an area like that, all you had to do was cut down the kanai grass, and you had an airstrip. Soon Dobadura was not only home to Allied fighters, but also the port of entry to a small swarm of priceless C-47 transport aircraft, which brought in every type of supply and evacuated the wounded. The Australians even figured out a way to dismantle artillery pieces and fly some of them, in the only hope that the Japanese had at Buona was that the siege, as in medieval times, would collapse due to disease and lack of supply. Dobadura ensured that would not happen. Japanese in the Bua area were doomed. The Japanese had been weakened at Guadalcanal, which was lost just after Bua, and their positions at Lae and Salawa were likewise in peril. When Dodura opened in November, more Allied aircraft were appearing, including some more modern types backed by the facilities at Morbi and Townsville. The Allies were able to keep more of their limited supply of aircraft combat ready than could the Japanese at Rabaul for the time being. However, the Japanese still had teeth, as Robert Rutherford found out. At Bua, we were pinching the Japanese very badly. They started to react with fierce air attacks from Gasmata and Rabaul. We were sent in to protect Dobadura. The day I landed, I got strafed. I was caught out in a field by a Zero. It was damn fortunate their 20mm cannon were on the wings, because one path of bullets passed one side of me, the other passed on the other side. I will never forget that plane was right on top Of me before I saw it he came over fishtailing right over the palm trees. There I think he was after the field. Kitchen we had just unloaded our stove was brand new, and silver he saw those. And I'm sure that was what he was shooting at. In any case, I looked down and saw the pock marks left by the 20 millimeters. They left a hole. When they exploded about the size of your spread-out hand, the Japanese got wise pretty fast. They did the same thing that they did at Morby. Their bombers came in a long line, like a parade ground formation with 15 to 25 aircraft lined up at about 20,000 feet. They would drop their bombs in a pattern trying to blanket a valuable area, not hit an individual target there. Favorite bomb was a daisy cutter. I never saw a whole one. We had shell for the 155 artillery piece that did the same thing. It had a fuse that stuck out nearly a foot in front when it hit. The explosion was instantaneous. The fragments just cleared the ground. The Japanese bombs did the same thing. If a fellow had a head or a hand up, there was a possibility he might lose it, and the swirling spinning whistle they made was unforgettable. Establishing Didura and taking Bua was the beginning and not the end of the Allied offensive in New Guinea. From that time onward, the Japanese tasted defeat after defeat. They were stopped trying to take a straight Ike airfield inland at WWII in March 1943. Allied aircraft obliterated a large supply convoy in the Bismarck Sea, illustrating dramatically that Japanese ground forces could not be supplied from any point near the front as basic supplies, and shipping slowly moved into his theater of war. MacArthur had the airbase's aircraft and manpower to move up the New Guinea coast, bypassing major Japanese garrisons. Each step brought new bases like Nadab Gap and Sealy, and moved the Allies to a position where they could break out of New Guinea and move toward the Philippines and East Indies. The C-47 transports helped supply a major Australian land campaign up the Markham Valley. Along the way, Allied air units helped crush Rabaul and devastated WWII, ruining 2 Japanese Air Forces. Admiral Ina, relieved from fleet duty after the Coral Sea and made head of the Japanese Naval Academy, must have watched with horror, and understanding Admiral Inouye would also have understood the extraordinary events that transpired in the South Pacific in the aftermath of Midway. Prior to the Battle of the Coral Sea, the United States Navy and its Confederates were preparing feverishly for a series of defensive battles expected to take place between Pearl Harbor and New Zealand and Australia. Prospects certainly did not look good. In the spring, the Navy decided that Auckland, New Zealand would serve as its forward base of operations for the theater. Despite its distance from potential battlefields such as New Caledonia and Samoa, there can be little question that the United States Pacific Fleet would have defended its lines of communication with the South Pacific. However, although no one liked to speak in these terms, if a desperate situation arose, the security of the United States Fleet took precedence in Washington to the security of New Zealand or Australia. Oakland, despite its geographic disadvantages, was an ideal base in every other respect, and during the defensive stage of the war served admirably. When Midway brought the strategic scale close to even, Admiral King proved quick to move. Although MacArthur and King despised each other, they agreed that more United States forces should be sent to the Pacific. The United States services and their allies agreed on an arbitrary command line between the South Pacific and Southwest Pacific areas. MacArthur commanded the Southwest area, and Vice Admiral Robert Gormley was made commander of the South Pacific Area, a subdivision of the Pacific Theater commanded by Chester Nimitz. An arbitrary administrative line ran through the geographic realities of the overall theater. There was, however, a tremendous difference. MacArthur was a theater commander, the rank being defined and deified by the British-American combined chiefs of staff. In other words, MacArthur ranked with Britain's Harold Alexander, Eisenhower, Lord Mountbatten, and Nimitz among the high lords of Allied strategy. His naval counterparts, Gormley and Admiral William Hawley, held subordinate commands under Nimitz, who was MacArthur's only equal in the Pacific. Through the aces of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, both the United States Army and United States Navy, the Marine Corps obviously included, agreed upon a general 3-stage attack against Rabaul. King had been calling for a move against Toy for months, and that would constitute the Navy's portion of the first stage. However, in practice, the staged attack was so much paper in the basket until either commander could bring home some bacon. MacArthur faced South Seas Detachment's attack on Morby. King was ready for his great gamble and greatest strategic triumph. Before playing his hand, however, King needed some chips. Prior to Midway, the route between Hawaii and Australia was desperate improvisation designed to defend. Communications between the 2 points after the American victory at Midway changed the strategic balance. The route could be used for an alley offensive buildup, however, like the Allies in Australia and New Guinea, Gourley and King needed sophisticated advance bases to support the move against the Solomons. Although the attack was scheduled for August, the Americans did not have their rear in order once it was obvious that Auckland was too distant to serve as a good fleet and airbase. Instead, the United States Navy had to rely on some of the areas it had occupied while constructing the Philippines ferry route. Because of pure inertia, a logical start was made at New Caledonia, the largest island between New Zealand, New Guinea, and southeastern Australia. As noted, the United States Navy was so worried that Japan would attack New Caledonia that it convinced the United States Army that an entire division was required for its defense. There was nothing at all foolish about this request, as the Japanese planned to attack New Caledonia after a victory at Midway. A free French possession, New Caledonia was the largest and best-suited island in the South Pacific to serve as both an advanced air and naval base. The capital, Noumea, with a population of 11,000, offered some assets that could help the war effort, especially Tantuta Airfield. Noumea hosted a house of prostitution that, to put it mildly, thrived throughout the war, although by mid-1943 there were 3 fields on New Caledonia, and the island was developing into a massive supply depot. Anyone hoping for a touch of the Riviera in the South Pacific was sorely disappointed. John Herbert, who was a pilot aboard the British carrier His Majesty's ship Victorious, that constituted, along with Saratoga, the United States Navy's carrier reserve in the summer of 1943, described Tantuta as a dump. New Caledonia was a French colony, and to Herbert, Noumea was a dirty, scruffy little town. In truth, New Caledonia was not a major airbase because it was too distant from the Solomons, yet it was considerably closer to the Solomons than was New Zealand. When operations began at Guadalcanal in August, a frantic effort began to develop the port and supply facilities at Noumea. By early 1943, Noumea was an important naval base and the central depot supplying operations in the Solomons. When Midway allowed a more aggressive deployment, the Allies were quick to move north of New Caledonia into the New Hees Islands. King had his eye on the island of Epate in the southern New Hees from a very early date. In March, a small United States Army detachment moved up and occupied the little jungle island, and in April a Marine battalion followed the initial expedition. Literally sneaked, and there was considerable fear that if Japanese reconnaissance spotted the Marines building an airstrip, they would move down and take it. The New Herdes were indeed on the Japanese hit list. Scheduled to start after a Japanese victory at Midway, Marine engineer Captain John K. Little related his feelings about a year after their clandestine arrival. We were right up there under Tojo's chin. If he only opened his mouth, we would fall, and a couple of Japanese destroyers could have cleaned us out at any time. That is what it meant being a forward echelon. We were for war, all right. We were right on the edge of the falling off place. The Marines hacked a fighter base out of the jungle. In the months that followed, CBS built another fighter field and small bomber field along with basic port facilities. Epate, however, was a very malarial island, worse than others in that part of the Pacific. It was a hardship post and never lived up to King's designs. Fortunately, the Allies did not need F-8 200M north of Fate, 400M north of Noumea, and 500 mil southeast of Guadalcanal. Was Espiritu Santo the largest island in the New Herdes and the best situated to aid the planned United States attack on Guadalcanal. Although the largest island in the New Hebrides and possessing a splendid anchorage, Espiritu had a tiny population and was occupied in late June by a small United States unit. In July, the Americans knew that the Japanese were building an airstrip on Guadalcanal. American engineers rushed to beat the Japanese to the punch, a race the Japanese did not know about, and in less than a month B-7S began bombing Guadalcanal. The United States Navy quickly followed up by bringing in specialized aviation CB units and constructed 2 full-fledged bomber bases and 2 fighter bases capable of ferrying fighters to Guadalcanal. The United States Navy constructed extensive air facilities, including a full shop that could refurbish warplanes, a hospital, and housing for a large air contingent. More importantly, Espiritu developed into the primary forward naval base in the first stage of the Solomons campaign. Although port facilities were crude and naval repair vessel was brought in, and a supply of naval ammunition began to grow. It was to Espiritu that the United States Navy warships retreated after the vicious battles of Guadalcanal in early 1943. The Navy brought in Lion I, a space force ordered to create a full-blown naval base at Espiritu. Huge stocks of fuel were gathered there, making Espiritu one of the busiest places in the South Pacific. It was a perfect complement to the growing supply depot at Numa. Espiritu had another advantage. Like New Mayor, there was very little malaria. Nevertheless, as a rear area, there was nothing to attract the average serviceman other than the fact that it was out of range of Japanese air attack. Tom Powell was an airman on the face carrier Enterprise, and he found no fond memories. Reflecting on his days at Espiritu, we were in port a good deal of the time. We would stay over on the beach in Quonset huts or tents. If we were not flying, we would go skin diving or swimming out in the surf. We had movies. At night we were billeted near a bomber strip, and the road took a curve right through our camp. Every time a truck would go by, there would be more coral dust to settle down on our cots. There was not much there, and we all got bored. We would eat a bunch of mutton and take cold showers. As a matter of fact, while we were allowed to go to the ship once a week for liberty to most sailors, that sounds funny, but things were a lot better on board ship. You could get a hot shower and ice cream, watch a movie without rain hitting your head, and sack out in a bunk without being attacked by mosquitoes. So it was not bad for liberty. It was hot aboard ship, but not that bad. If it got too hot, you would go topside if you were in port and look for some shade and sleep. Yet the combination of Auckland, New Caledonia, and Espiritu could not make up for the Allies' lack of ships and men in almost any rational quantification of men and material. The Japanese still possessed overall superiority in the South Pacific. However, this combination of bases gave to the United States Navy and the Allies the opportunity to concentrate force and offer battle at a very early date. Admiral King had long had his eye on Tulagi as the first location for a slow drive toward Rabel. Marshall and Nimitz agreed that this three-stage operation would ultimately lead to an attack on Rabu itself. It is almost impossible to determine what the respective commanders had in mind. King's heart was never in the South Pacific. He believed that the fastest way to defeat Japan was to attack directly across the Central Pacific. The basic logic was impeccable and was the Pacific version of the Europe First strategy. The most effective way to defeat Japan, so went the argument, was to neutralize True Seas Japan and the Marianas and begin an attack on Japan by air directly. The problem with the Central Pacific advance was that it did not make sense to allocate large amounts of forces, particularly the fleet units in existence after Midway, to a secondary campaign. Far better to stand on the defensive and gather the attack force when it was ready. In late 1943, when the United States fleet would double in size in a few weeks because of the building program, a timeout would have likewise aided the Japanese. Indeed, combined fleet wanted nothing more than to rebuild its carrier strike force after Midway. King and his admirals faced a serious quandary. King very much wanted to show that the United States Navy and Marines could begin their arduous task as soon as possible. In addition, they had genuine concerns that the Japanese might still attempt to expand their zone of control deep into the South Pacific. Yet a campaign in the South Pacific, now that Australia and New Zealand were unquestionably safe, ran a serious risk. Regardless of the losses at Midway, any major United States fleet action in the fall of 1942 was a great gamble. King, Marshall, and every Japanese admiral in Imperial intelligence realized that the Essex-class carriers, powerful light carriers, fast battleships, and a multitude of modern destroyers would be in action by late 1943. This is not to mention the submarine fleet being constructed at a furious pace. No one, particularly after a series of defeats going back to Pearl Harbor, could rule out a stinging blow to the United States Navy. In addition, moving forward in the South Pacific, engage the Navy with both the Australians and Mather. A raid in force was strategically pointless and politically dangerous. Furthermore, MacArthur and the Australians were, showing an ability to engage the Japanese Empire in a very serious manner by fall. 1942 South Seas Detachment's attack over the Owen Staines guaranteed these considerations never took place simultaneously during the early decision to invade Guadalcanal, but all came up. During the Solomons Campaign, MacArthur claimed that with one more division and the use of a major portion of the Pacific Fleet, he could land on New Britain and quickly choke off Rebel. The plan in mid-1942 was not as mad as it might appear. The great land garrison on New Britain did not appear for months. MacArthur's plans did depend, however, on the ability of the United States Navy to maintain naval supremacy over an area where his own air forces had not yet extended fight AR range. MacArthur was not beyond a flight of fancy, but in this case an early attack on New Britain would have been audacious and promised huge gains compared to the risks, whether the Pacific Fleet wanted it or not. Combined fleet still reeling from Midway would have had to come out and fight a great action. The idea interested many admirals, but an older and seemingly more conservative idea won out. That idea represented Admiral King's greatest moment operation Watchtower. The genesis of the operation came early. The Solomon Islands were never occupied the same way a European target was. Beyond that, there was always the matter of distance. Tajai, the traditional British administrative center of the Solomons, also gave the owners the ability to launch long-range seaplanes across the area. After the Coral Sea victory, Admiral King, with the full support of the Australian and New Zealand navies, decided that it was worth the effort to take Tulagi. Yet the Japanese had seized the anchorage during the Coral Sea Campaign. Apparently, by accident, a Japanese expedition from Tajai found suitable ground upon which to build an airstrip on the neighboring island of Guadalcanal. The United States Campaign, originally aimed at the small anchorage at Tulagi, quickly took on a frantic pace. They must take Guadalcanal before the Japanese airstrip was complete, or the entire operation would be unworthy of the risks imposed on Pacific Fleet. A moderate leader might well have delayed operations and hoped for the best in New Guinea. King instead went forward with little hesitation. Rarely, if ever, in American military history have ground troops and a fleet been assembled so quickly as the task force that struck Guadalcanal. The Guadalcanal Campaign revolved around the most famous air base of the Pacific War, Henderson Field. Several other battles were larger than Guadalcanal in the air, although not at sea, but none illustrated more clearly the tempo and flow of air combat in the South Pacific. Guadalcanal also proved that the Japanese had no idea how to wage war in the air, misled by cheap victories in China and unable to accommodate lessons from the border conflict with Russia. The Japanese Navy Air Force gave itself a mission that it could not possibly accomplish. Once the Americans seized the airfield on Guadalcanal, the Japanese had only two choices: either withdraw and fight the Allies much nearer Rebel, or commit combined fleet to a sustained engagement with nothing held back, as was so typical of the Japanese. Combined fleet decided on a middle course that preserved the fleet for a battle that it must lose in the long run, but also engaged enough Imperial forces that the losses cut the nerve endings out of both the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Japanese Navy Air Force. The damage done to combined fleet was so severe that naval war likewise strategically ended in the Solomons. The story itself is simple enough. The Marines landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942. At the same time, a smaller group destroyed the garrison at Tulagi. Surprised, the Japanese had had only pioneers on Guadalcanal and few combat troops. On the second day, the Marines completed the occupation of the airfield being constructed by the Japanese. The Guadalcanal effort included the largest group of Allied ships engaged for any effort up until that time. Leading the force were 3 fleet aircraft carriers that bombed every target imaginable during the landing inside the air range of RAB's bombers. The United States carriers were extremely eager to leave the area, although the decision to do so has been defended by many and despised by the Marines, who felt abandoned by the United States Navy strike force. The Americans were reacting to the same fear showed by the Japanese of land-based air attack. Combined fleet, however, showed a weapon neglected until that time: the surface warships of the Empire outside Savo Island just off Guadalcanal. Imperial Japanese Navy warships wounded the Allied force badly. just as the carriers were sailing to presumed safety. 4 Allied cruisers went down as compared to 1 Japanese. Furthermore, the possibility that the Japanese warships could have run amok among Allied transports was not lost on American commanders, as it was the gruff but brilliant United States Admiral Kelly Turner began his illustrious career by keeping his transports in harbor for an entire day and sailing off with a huge grudge against the American strike force that should have been protecting the fleet. In fact, however, the victory won by Japan was utterly hollow. 4 cruisers sunk was a good score, but the Japanese effort to stop the invasion had failed. On August 21st, the Americans completed the airstrip already begun by the Japanese, and the first Marine fighters landed. Henderson Field, named to honor a Marine hero dead at Midway, immediately became the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific War. What Yamamoto was learning would become common knowledge during World War II. If the invasion fleet arrived, it was probably too late to do anything. This did not necessarily prove that carrier-based aircraft was superior to land-based defenders. Indeed, the saga of Henderson Field proved the superiority of land-based aircraft if they could keep within range of the target's Guadalcanal, would show that allowing an enemy land-based air force within one strategic perimeter was remarkably similar to allowing an enemy to cross a river and establish a bridgehead. Once a bridgehead is established on land, it will either be destroyed or the attackers will ultimately break out in air warfare. The problem was exactly the same. If an air base became established, there were only 2 ways to knock it out: a sustained and brutal air offensive or a naval blockade and bombardment. Although the beginnings were humble, the lessons of Henderson Field illustrated the tremendous advantage held by the defense as well as the great danger posed by even a small air base against shipping, both naval and transport. Although it would not have been any secret in Yamamoto's headquarters, most commentators since the war have missed the obvious. The Japanese at Rabaul were too far away to smother Henderson Field by air combined fleet. For reasons that must always remain a mystery, refused to take the risk that could have led to victory. A sustained naval blockade and systematic and repeated bombardment of Henderson Field and the airfield complex developed at Guadalcanal are linked in history with the famous United States Navy. CBS. At the outset of war, the United States Navy's equivalent of the Army Corps of Engineers was the Civil Engineer Corps. Although working for the Navy, the personnel were mostly civilians, showing the fast action and improvisation that Tokyo did not expect. The United States Navy immediately discerned the necessity for construction engineers working within the millet framework. Rear Admiral Ben Morrell pushed for organization of United States Navy construction units. On January 5, 1942, he gained authority to recruit men from the construction trades for assignment to a naval construction regiment composed of 3 naval construction battalions. This is the actual beginning of the CBS. Admiral Morrell personally furnished the official motto, "We build, we fight." Admiral Morrell also won an administrative battle of great importance. Navy regulations required that command of naval personnel go to line officers. Morrell, despite opposition from the Navy's formidable bureaucracy, was granted his request that his CBS be commanded by men who were commissioned from the Civil Engineer Corps. At the outset, the Navy substantially lowered recruitment standards for the CBS, although more than 200 CBS were dead in action and nearly 2,000 wounded. Their task, unlike the Army's combat engineers or the Marines' pioneer battalions, was construction, not battle. Therefore, the United States Navy sensibly looked for men with experience in the building trades, not seamen. The age range was initially 18 to 50, and early in the war, the United States Navy found 60-year-old men in the ranks. As a Navy monograph on the subject noted, the first recruits were the men who had helped to build Boulder Dam, the national highways, and New York skyscrapers, who had worked in the mines and quarries and dug the subway tunnels, who had worked in shipyards and built docks and wharves, and even ocean liners and aircraft carriers. By the end of the war, 325,000 such men had enlisted in the CBS. They knew more than 60 skilled trades, not to mention the unofficial ones of souvenir making and moonlight procurement. At the end of 1942, the special status of the CBS ended. Other than their command by engineers, the labor shortage of skilled men at home was growing acute, and some of the older men were not up to the physical Punishments sustained at places like Guadalcanal and the UNs after December 1942. The CBS gained their men from the selective service pool, and the average age and level of skill dropped. The men proved quick learners, however, and in the Pacific Theater, the CBS constructed 111 airfields and housing for 1.5 million men. Among other things, the CBS often worked in close proximity with the Corps of Engineers on Okinawa. CB officer commanded 100,000 CBS and Army engineers in the largest construction command of the war. The actual construction of Henderson Field was largely done by the two Japanese pioneer units dispatched several weeks before. Because the Marines anticipated combat, of which there was luckily little, they did not immediately employ CBS, and instead the job of completing the strip was left to the 1st Marine Division's combat engineers. The landing had been a logistical nightmare, and thanks to Japanese air attack and the defeat at saw the original force of United States transports sailed away partially loaded. Only one United States bulldozer was ashore. Fortunately, the Marines did capture the light Japanese construction equipment working feverishly. They extended the strip to 3,800 feet in length and 150 in width. The fact that Japanese soldiers made no effort to destroy their supplies, without which the Marines would have been in deadly peril, is testimony to the total surprise achieved by the Americans at Guadalcanal. Ironically, Vice Admiral Gishi Mawa, the brilliant victor at Savo, had advised his superiors in previous weeks that a United States attack on Guadalcanal was possible in way 2 prior to his reassignment in October. Had expressed concern. Imperial headquarters, however, was convinced that no United States offensive could take place before 1943. Japanese intelligence had not even identified the existence of the new command arrangement creating the South Pacific area under Vice Admiral Robert Gorley. The drift and disorganization noticed by German Attaché Wiener was appearing at Rabel as the strip on Guadalcanal neared completion. It was still not clear where the Japanese were going to find the aircraft to operate in the event the Americans solved that problem for them. By any definition, Henderson was a very crude place. In the early weeks of the struggle, it lacked taxiways, revetments, drainage, steel matting, and proper fuel tanks. Its rolled dirt surface was adequate but proved hazardous and vulnerable to temporary damage. Guadalcanal itself had nothing resembling workable dock facilities. The Marines, in short, needed the CBS. They also needed the sailors of Cub 1, the first 12 naval units set up to help create and then operate small naval bases on islands like Guadalcanal, where facilities did not exist in mid-1942. However, neither Cubs nor Lions were even close to fully operational. The sailors of Cub 1 joined their CB comrades to help keep Henderson in action, keeping Henderson Field in operation and building a second and smaller fighter field nearby immediately. Dubbed Fighter 1 was a task that transcended anything in the realm of construction engineering and ground service. Instead, Henderson itself was the center of an air, naval, and ground battle, and became one of the great epics in American military history. Initially, the 1st Marine Division had their way. The remains of the Japanese pioneers fled into the dense jungle. Several Koreans found the means to surrender, probably wisely. General Archer Vander Gree, with his supply situation precarious and fearing a Japanese invasion over the same beach he had just seized at Lunga Point, decided to use his infantry to create a perimeter around Henderson Field. Not realizing the strength of the United States force on the island, 900 Japanese attack troops made a vain attack on the marine perimeter on August 20th and suffered near annihilation. From that point on, both the Americans and Japanese tried to reinforce their land forces on Guadalcanal. The Japanese seized beaches west of Lunga Point and of Henderson Field. Because of United States dive bombers at Henderson, the Japanese did not feel that it was secure to bring in standard troop transports. Therefore, with some spectacular exceptions that triggered major naval engagements, the Japanese used destroyers and small barges to make the journey up the Solomons, because there were islands on both sides of the line between Japanese-held Bonneville and the Marines at Henderson. The Americans called this Japanese line of approach the slot, and the ships that traveled at the Tokyo Express so both Sides attempted to build ground forces on the same island, their major positions separated only by about 15 miles. The Japanese proved able to move a large force of infantry to Guadalcanal, but were always short of supplies and material. The Americans moved in fewer men at first, but after the first hungry weeks, they did a far better job of keeping the United States garrison supplied with food, medicine, and heavy weaponry. However, for more than 4 months, the small perimeter around Henderson and Fighter 1 was under siege. Japanese infantry maintained observation posts, allowing them to detect everything at the airstrips. Japanese warships knew exactly where to make night bombardments. Also, the Japanese Navy Air Force at Naval, employing aircraft with great range, were able to strike at Henderson without fear of serious reprisal at their own base. Consequently, the pilots, ground crews, and service personnel were under fire of one sort or another for weeks on, and the most persistent threat came from a steady stream of Japanese air attacks. Tony Biak was a crew chief for Marine Wildcat fighters and recalled the deadly routine air attacks were almost every day during October, sometimes several. You would lose track of how many attacks there were when the Japanese came in. The Zeros would come in and try to engage our fighters and try to draw them away from the bombers. The bombers would come in these V formations. I would count usually about 25 planes. They would come, and believe me, they had their bombs sighted right down the center of the field. The Zeros would try to keep the fighters away, and the bombers would drop their bombs. After they dropped, they would continue on eastward. In the meantime, our remaining fighters would try to engage. That October was especially bad because we often had few planes in the air. I tried to keep a record of all the strafing bombings and shelling, and counted close to 200. David Galvin was a rear gunner on a Marine dive bomber. His description makes clear how crude and vulnerable Henderson Field was. As he also pointed out, attack did not always come from high level. Henderson looked like a very small pasture with a whole lot of holes in it when I first arrived. I mean, a narrow one. 2. When you come into Guadalcanal, there was a grove of coconut trees, maybe 3/4 of a mile. Then you go into an opening, a little kind of meadow that extended from Tanner River running east by southeast. On the opposite side was jungle, thick jungle, a solid mass of trees and brush. There was no transition zone. For a while in late August, we only had about 10 aircraft. We would work in the open or in the jungle, which was a few feet away, gave us a lot of shade. Sometimes those Bettys would come in awfully low. Well, under 5,000 feet, you could see right into the belly of the ship. It was incredible. The Japanese also employed almost nightly harassment attacks by lone bombers, a tactic later employed by the Allies. Often the night intruder unsynchronized the propeller to make more noise. It is not clear whether this technique was done to add harassment value or to throw off the crude audio devices that were used to help direct night anti-aircraft fire. In either case, the troops dubbed these planes washing Machine Charlie. The Charlie character became a fixture over every Pacific battlefield, but he is best known for his TS at Guadalcanal. Fly soldier Robert Ballantyne, like everyone in perimeter, had to put up with Charlie. You never knew where Charlie would drop a bomb. We would get into our big bunkers after while we got used to it, you would sit there and watch him. The searchlight beams from the anti-aircraft units would catch the plane. He was not very high, and he would fly in and out of the beam. Of course, they could not hit him. But it was quite a sight. Sometimes you could hear the bay door kind of click open. You sure could hear the bombs coming down. If it makes a kind of swooshing, whirling noise, the bomb is by you and will miss. If it is hissing, it is going to be close, and you might have to change your underwear. Once a Betty bomber came down near our position on the line. We went over to the wreck and checked it out. The crew could not get out, I guess, and they were spread out all over. I have never seen so many vertebrae. They looked like ham bones, as one might imagine. The Americans on Guadalcanal grew very weary of being bombed and strafed with slight let-up when the enemy took a blow. Those lucky to see it were delighted. Marine Clifford Fox describes an exceptional incident. The Japanese fighters would come down and strafe us. I was strafed several times, especially when we were on the RIDG lines. They would came in at treetop level or lower if there were not any trees. If you looked up, you could see the pilots' face. One day in November on Vicious Ridge, some Zeros strafed us. It was a bad day for one of them. The Army flew P-39 era Cobras for low-altitude ground Attack they could not compete with the Zeros at high altitude, but at ground level, they could get the jump on a Zero. Anyway, this Japanese came over, and we ducked into our hole and started shooting our rifles at him. That was futile really, but made us feel good over the trees. AP-39 came and he caught the Japanese plane with his cannon, and the Zero disintegrated in the air. It floated right down into this ravine in the jungle in front of us. You could see the pilot and the engine of this Zero coming down together. They were the heaviest objects, and going forward the fastest. The rest of the plane was sort of floating earthward, shot to smither. We were all cheering, but it did not always go our way. A few times we saw our own planes coming back from dogfights. Sometimes they could not make it to Henderson, and we would watch them crash into the jungle. Another potential hazard presented itself from the air. When bombers came over, anti-aircraft opened fire. Shell fragments would come raining down. This was a very serious problem in cities that underwent major air raids and were protected by hundreds of high-caliber guns. When the massed machine gun fire of a large dogfight took place right over the field, there was also potentially lethal debris falling to earth. Worse yet for the United States GAR, because the perimeter was so close to the front lines, Japanese snipers could infiltrate and fire at the men working on American aircraft in the open. Increasing the tension still further was periodic artillery fire. All Japanese infantry units carried small 75mm pack howitzers that were poor artillery but could make life hazardous for aircraft ground crews. Later in the campaign, the Japanese brought in some batteries of more powerful guns lacking shells to make a sustained attack on the Dujin Marines. The Japanese gunners fired quick barges, nicknamed Pistol Pete by the Americans, into Henderson. Such harassment led to self-imposed battlefield informality, where one did not sport one's rank and there was no saluting. Twice during the siege of Henderson Field, the Japanese made serious attacks on the perimeter. The brutal terrain gave them an unusual chance for success, considering the respective size and firepower of the units involved. The first major attack in September came closer than any other two, breaking the perimeter and allowing the Japanese to devastate Henderson, even if they lacked the men to hold it. Because the perimeter was so small, the airmen of the Cactus Air Force became involved in these attacks. Cactus Air Force comprised the air units on Guadalcanal. Cactus was the code name for the island. David Galvin helped create a final line with the powerful machine guns of the Cactus Air Force during the Battle of Vicious Ridge. The closest the Japanese came to breaking the Marine line in September, we lined up our 8 or so SBDS wing to wing with the rear guns facing the tree lines, so afraid we were that the Japanese would break through. They also had 2 F-4FS with the tails jacked up, so someone could fire the 650 caliber machine guns. That night was hell. Savagery on both sides. That night everything was firing, nothing was held back. Shells went flying over our head. We were very close to the battle and could hear the artillery, the gunfire, the screaming. The Marines on the ridge were heroic. We knew it was make or break. It was very hard to see into the jungle, but if anyone had attacked the field, we would have fired with everything we had. The next morning everybody was worn out and exhausted, but elated. Nobody was saying anything, nobody talking, because it was so terrible. But you are also excited. In my case, my ribs were hurting. I was chilled and shivering. The next morning my ribs felt so badly, I just had to rejuvenate. We were quiet. We had our private thoughts. Everybody had a cigarette. I did not smoke, but even I had one to calm down. Although Guadalcanal is viewed today as a heroic struggle by the Marines and Cactus Air Force, the campaign was above all the place of suffering for the United States Navy. It was a battle that allowed no failure by any service, and the 150-year history of the United States Navy propelled Pacific Fleet to Iron Bottom Sound, the area between Guadalcanal and Tajai within 50 miles of Henderson Field. The United States Navy and Imperial Japanese Navy fought a series of vicious service battles at night, the outcomes of which potentially meant the difference between winning and losing the campaign. In between Pearl Harbor and the onset of the 1943 building program, much of the United States Navy's proud 1930s legacy perished off Guadalcanal. Fortunately for the United States warships lost off Lunga Point were joined at the bottom by many Japanese counterparts. The battles off Guadalcanal devastated the pre-Pearl Harbor carrier Force severely damaged the first-generation fast battleships, wreak havoc on United States cruisers of all types, and left Iron Bottom Sound littered with dead destroyers, yet the victims that sank with them, including 2 Japanese battleships, ultimately provided what combined fleet feared most. The United States Navy was badly hurt, but it had hurt the Imperial Japanese Navy in turn. If the Japanese were not able to collect on their superior pre-war training and doctrine in 1942, the prospects for 1943, when the United States Navy would gain a superior force, were very gloomy at the time of the Battle of Guadalcanal. However, such considerations were abstract. Many men on the island, seeing only Japanese bombers and suffering Japanese surface attack, feared another Allied blunder. Considering the Allied record in the Philippines and East Indies, such pessimism was warranted. Indeed, Gormley's indication that the commander at Guadalcanal could consider surrender if necessary was his death sentence as Commander Crew Chief Biak recalled the feeling on Guadalcanal during the period of crisis. We all feared defeat and capture. I think we were afraid they were going to leave us there. We believed that Holly and Roosevelt saved us. For a while we were almost cut off. I remember when they tried to bring in some gasoline on a barge, and there were 5 naval personnel on the barge with a tug. The Japanese blew up the barge and the tug, but we never got the gas. We were draining every drop possible out of gasoline drums we thought were already empty. Nothing was wasted. Everything was desperately short. In October, everything, when the Army came in, everything was better. The airmen and ground crew at Guadalcanal suffered bombardment from Japanese destroyers on a regular basis. At night, both sides would send in their cans and bombard respective positions. However, the Americans, holding Henderson and Fighter 1, possessed a target that was good for any attack. Twice during the campaign, combined fleet sent capital ships to bombard Henderson, the first coming on October 17, 1942. On that evening, combined fleet risked 2 battleships and accompanying cruisers on an attack against Henderson that was to correspond with a breakthrough by Japanese infantry of the marine perimeter. They also hoped to demolish Henderson totally. In practice, the attack failed in both regards, but gave the Marines the worst time of the campaign. Tony Biak was there. The bombardment was terrible, almost beyond belief. They had battle wagons, cruisers, and destroyers. After the big stuff pulled out of subsurface and shelled us, the fields were the main target all the time. This bothers me about accounts of Guadalcanal. Ground personnel like myself never get much credit because we were not on the front, even though the front was a few 100 yards away. Those battles on the front were intense and fierce, but few, and lasted only a few hours. The men by the strip, however, were under constant shelling, bombing, strafing, sniper fire, and artillery fire from the hills, and then washing machine Charlie. We were under fire continuously. It never let up until the day I left. The bombardment started out with Charlie, a plane from a cruiser or battleship, a couple of them. Just prior to shelling, they dropped parachute flares that lit up the terrain. It was a clear night, and they dropped them right on the field. It was a very eerie sight. The flares were very bright, like an arc light, and lit up a good bit of ground with a single flare. The planes dropped several of course, we could see the first salvo fired from the ship very clearly, but after the first shell hit, we all headed for our holes and kept our head down. We were all in there praying and swearing, just terrifying. It lasted about 90 minutes of constant fire. The time dragged like it would never end. The sound was deafening. You could hear the shells come and making this freight train-like noise. We could see the flashes and light and glare would come into the hole. It was not that deep. I was watching the other guys in the hole myself and was terrified, and so were they. Bombardment wears you down psychologically. It is just draining. There is nothing to do but sit there